Dick Van Dyke, who is 100 years old, is more than just a legendary figure in Hollywood. He is a living history of entertainment. However, living to be a century old has a high cost. Bidding farewell to those who accompanied him on that lengthy journey. Come along as we examine the 6 famous deaths that had the biggest impact on Dick Van Dyke. The 100th anniversary of Van Dyke. Prior to becoming a globally recognized celebrity, Dick Van Dyke was a small child growing up in the Midwest. Although he was born in West Plains, Missouri, in 1925, he grew up primarily in Danville, Illinois. His life was straightforward and his family was not well off. Even as a little boy, Dick was incredibly energetic. He enjoyed jogging, dancing, and making others laugh. He didn't initially intend to become an actor, which is one of the most intriguing aspects of his early life. Because he enjoyed interacting with people and was quite involved in his church, he seriously thought about becoming a pastor while still in high school. He also joined the theatrical club, though, and found that he was naturally gifted on stage. He enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces when World War II broke out. He participated in variety events and worked as a radio announcer to amuse his fellow troops even while he was in the military. Through this encounter, he came to the realization that, after the war, he wanted to work in entertainment. Dick began his career in radio after the war and then transitioned to television. Things were extremely different in the early days of television than they are now. Performers have to complete a variety of tasks for many local shows. Dick and his friend Phil Erickson formed a comedy duet called the Merry Mutes. They traveled around doing pantomime, a kind of acting in which you convey a story without speaking by using your face and body. Dick honed his physical comedy skills here, including his well-known rubber legs and his ability to fall without getting wounded. Dick relocated to New York City in the late 1950s in order to try his hand at Broadway. For him, this was a major turning point. He was cast in the musical Bye Bye Birdie. His natural talent and coordination earned him a Tony Award for his performance, despite the fact that he was not a trained dancer. Hollywood people started taking notice. A tall, slender man who was capable of acting, dancing, and singing simultaneously caught their attention. As a result, the Dick Van Dyke Show was founded in 1961. He was a superstar thanks to this show. He portrayed Rob Patry, a humorous TV writer who often seemed to trip over an ottoman in his living room, and families from all across the nation would join together to watch him. Dick's career transitioned into the film industry once the Dick Van Dyke Show became popular. The movies he starred in are today regarded as some of the best ever. In Mary Poppins, he sang about happiness and danced with animated penguins as Bert the Chimney Sweep, which is how most people remember him. In addition, he starred in the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which was about a car that could fly. He became a global hero to children because of these roles. His smile became one of the most iconic features in Hollywood, and he had a knack of making every character feel like a buddy. Dick didn't slow down as he grew older. He began a completely new phase of his career with the television program Diagnosis, Murder in the 1990s. He portrayed a doctor who solved crimes in this series. Viewers adored it, even though it was a significant departure from his previous comedic parts. The 8-year run of the show demonstrated Dick's ability to maintain his popularity among viewers of all ages. Even in his 90s, he continued to feature in films like Night at the Museum and made a comeback for a unique dance performance in the new Mary Poppins Returns. Let's examine the first individual on Dick's list of pals who influenced his career now that we know how he became famous. More Mary Tyler. They were having a terrible time when the Dick Van Dyke Show's creators were trying to find someone to play Rob Petry's wife. They had already examined 60 actresses. The production needed a woman who could be attractive, humorous, and able to keep up with Dick Van Dyke's fast-paced physical humor. Dick Van Dyke was already cast. The executive producer, Sheldon Leonard, was becoming concerned. Then Mary Tyler Moore, a 23-year-old woman, entered the room. She was primarily recognized at the time for her joyful hot point dancing roles as an elf in advertisements. She had a really distinctive speech pattern when she read the lines. She seemed pleasant but apprehensive due to the gulp in her voice. In fact, Sheldon Leonard told her he had found her while grabbing her head with his hand. Dick Van Dyke instantly fell in love. Despite their 11-year age difference, they complemented each other like two parts of a puzzle. She didn't just stand there looking nice, and Dick saw it immediately away. She was just as adept at timing jokes as he was. After winning the role, she and the actor formed a collaboration that would alter the course of television. The characters of Rob and Laura Pitre gained notoriety as the episode was being filmed. Because of how naturally they connected, people all throughout America assumed they were a married couple. This wasn't merely acting. Dick and Mary grew to be very good friends. For years, they spent nearly every day together. Their shared dance experience was a major factor in their successful relationship. Both of them enjoyed moving. They might understand a dance routine or a physical humor without any conversation. They could determine when to trip, when to jump, or when to slip on the floor simply by glancing at one another. Their humor appeared effortless because of their common language. They weren't merely two performers reciting dialogue. Their movements were completely coordinated as a team. Dick has freely acknowledged that during those years, he harbored some feelings for Mary. He thought she was exceptional and talented. Nevertheless, they continued to have a close and courteous friendship. Behind the scenes, they did not always have an easy time in the 1960s. Both of them experienced personal hardships and the demands of fame. On the shoot, they became one another's pillars of support. The other was available to lighten the atmosphere with a joke or a nice word if one was having a rough day or felt anxious. They had a strong sense of family. And millions more homes were filled with that warmth through the TV screen. Mary Tyler Moore spent the majority of her life with type 1 diabetes. She was rather courageous about it, but as she grew older, the illness led to numerous health issues. She battled additional issues and started to lose her vision. Mary died in January 2017 at the age of 80. The news was upsetting to Dick Van Dyke. Despite not working together on a daily basis for a considerable amount of time, they continued to stay in touch and collaborated on specials over the years. He thought he had lost a true family member. He called her his work wife a lot. And when he lost her, a significant portion of his own life narrative vanished. Dick became the eulogist at her private memorial service. He discussed more than simply her notoriety and attractiveness. He talked about how talented and resilient she was. He informed the audience that Mary was the focal point of their performance. He clarified that although he received a lot of the laughs, Mary's heart and timing kept everything together. He recalled their time dancing on the soundstage and felt moved. Mary wasn't merely a co-star to Dick. She was the one who made him the legend that he is today. His affection for her remained unbreakable, as evidenced by the fact that, at the age of 100, he still talks about her with a twinkle in his eye and a hint of melancholy in his voice. Let's now examine Carl Reiner, who became Dick's closest comic sibling and the man who actually founded the program. Reiner Carl. Head of the Family was a television program that Carl Reiner wrote the script for in 1960. In reality, he had authored the main part himself. However, the producers weren't entirely satisfied with the way the pilot episode turned out. When Carl played the lead. Though they thought the main character deserved a different type of actor, they still thought the screenplay was good. Carl met Dick Van Dyke at this point. Carl had great success as an actor and writer, but he was also incredibly modest. He looked at Dick and saw that Dick had a unique kind of energy instead of getting angry that he wasn't the star. Carl made the decision to take a back seat and become the writer and creator while Dick took center stage. The fact that Carl was more concerned with creating a fantastic presentation than with being the center of attention made this a significant occasion. He turned to become the mastermind behind Dick's success, creating the Dick Van Dyke Show's universe around Dick's abilities. They developed a relationship that lasted for 60 years after they began working together. The fact that they were from different backgrounds made their bond intriguing. Carl was a master of Jewish-style humor, which is characterized by a lot of wordplay and rapid wit. Dick was a master of slapstick comedy, which is characterized by humorous falls and physical action. Together, they produced a look that was adored by all. They continued to be best friends over the years. Living close to one another, they established a pattern that was very reliable. These years were dubbed the game night years. Dick would spend nearly every evening at Carl's Beverly Hills home. After eating dinner together, they would watch TV or movies in the living room. They talked about comedy, their families, and the world for hours. Dick, according to Carl, was his inspiration. This implies that Carl would consider Dick's face and his delivery of the lines when he sat down to write something humorous. Carl was encouraged by Dick to be his most imaginative self. They weren't merely co-workers. For more than 50 years, they preferred to spend almost every evening together as if they were brothers. Carl Reiner, who was 98 years old, died on June 2020. Dick continued to pay him visits at his house till the very end. They still relished those quiet times together in the same home where they had spent thousands of meals, even as Carl grew older and weaker. Dick was devastated at Carl's passing. Having a best friend for 60 years makes them an integral part of your identity. Many people were moved by Dick's public remark following Carl's passing. "The world was considerably quieter without Carl's laughing," he added. He was referring to more than just a death. He meant that the world was no longer filled with a particular type of joy. Dick experienced the quiet in his own life as well. The movie marathons and the nightly meals were over. Carl was much than just a writer and boss to Dick. The only one who truly understood him was him. Those 60 years remain, to this day, the most significant collaboration in Dick's life. Next, we'll examine how Dick and Carl's relationship affected Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, as well as the following generation. Michelle and Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner and Dick Van Dyke were friends even before Rob was a well-known director. Due to their daily collaboration on the Dick Van Dyke Show, Dick and Carl Reiner's families became inextricably linked. At the start of the show, Rob was a small child and frequently ran around the TV studio. Dick was able to witness Rob's development from a young boy to a young adult. Dick assumed a role that felt like a second father to Rob because he and Carl were like siblings. He was a recurring figure in Rob's life, not merely a buddy of his father. Numerous holidays, birthdays, and informal weekends were spent together. Rob saw Dick as he would any other member of the family. Dick was proud to see Rob's early passions for acting and storytelling blossom on the stage where their iconic sitcom was filmed. The dynamic between Dick and Rob underwent a lovely transformation as the years went by. Rob Reiner went on to become a huge celebrity in his own right. Initially as an actor on All in the Family, he went on to become a renowned filmmaker. He was no longer merely Carl's child lingering on the set. He became Dick's peer. Now that they were both accomplished men in the same field, they could discuss the difficulties of directing and the craft of making people laugh. The people Rob brought into his life were part of this friendship. Penny Marshall, a highly renowned actress and director, was Rob's first wife. In the Reiner family's inner circle, she was referred to as Penny, yet the relationships were strong and intimate. Dick frequently appeared in their home. Actors, writers, and directors would congregate at the Reiner residence to converse, shop, and exchange tales as part of the old Hollywood social scene. Dick treasured these times because they symbolized a group of artists who genuinely cared about one another. As they grew older, the gang also depended on one another over these years. Together, they overcame the challenging times, particularly as the elder generation, those who had entered the field in the 1940s and 1950s, started to die. Dick and Rob relied on one another for support after Carl Reiner went away. Since they were the two who had loved Carl the most, they grew closer as a result of sharing their grief. There was a surprise that nobody anticipated in 2025. The world was shocked to learn of Rob and his wife Michelle's unexpected and unexplained demise. Dick Van Dyke was the most affected, though. Dick had already bid farewell to his wife, best friend Carl, and co-star Mary Tyler Moore at the age of almost 100. It was like losing his son to lose Rob, the youngster he had grown up with and the guy who was now his contemporary. Grieving was difficult and complex because the situation was so unexpected. Dick considered these deaths to be more than a personal tragedy. They indicated a door's final closure. These particular connections were the foundation of Dick's old Hollywood social circle, which he had inhabited for more than 60 years. The weekly get-togethers, the phone conversations about new scripts, and the shared recollections of the early days of television seemed to vanish along with Rob and Michelle. We will now discuss Walt Disney, the man who became Dick's longtime mentor and gave him his biggest cinematic break. Disney Walt. Due to his television program, Dick Van Dyke was becoming well known by the early 1960s. Walt Disney was among those who watched him from home. For his upcoming blockbuster film, Mary Poppins, Walt was searching for a replacement for Bert the Chimney Sweep. Dick's energy and ability to perform physical humor without coming across as overly forced appealed to him. Dick was personally approached by Walt to be cast in the role. During their meeting to discuss the film, Dick made a unique request. He had read the screenplay and recognized the elderly and sour banker Mr. Dawes Sr. Dick also aspired to play that role. He literally had to beg Walt to let him do it, despite the fact that he was young and fit at the time. At first, Walt wasn't sure, but Dick offered to do the part for free. He even performed a screen test wearing a lot of makeup to demonstrate his ability to act elderly. Dick's enthusiasm and his humorous gait so attracted Walt that he eventually agreed. This encounter marked the beginning of a business partnership that would forever alter Dick's life. For Dick, Walt Disney developed become much more than just a boss. Walt mentored Dick while the Mary Poppins movie was being filmed. Dick was transitioning from the fast-paced world of television to the slower-paced world of big-budget films, which demand a different sort of acting. Walt helped him through this change by showing him how to deal with the demands of a big-budget movie set. They had very similar views on life, which is why the two men got along so well. At their core, they both felt like children. Walt was a huge fan of new technology and innovation. Dick was also always captivated by the workings of the world. In Burbank, they would frequently hang out on the Disney lot. Dick frequently saw Walt strolling around the studio, interacting with the artists and checking on work. Walt would separate himself from Dick and provide him candid counsel over his professional path. He advised Dick to never lose his sense of wonder and to always select initiatives that made people feel happy. Dick listened to Walt's every word since he was so wise and accomplished. He thought he was attending a master class in entertainment from the world's greatest visionary. Dick's film career reached a peak in 1966. He was one of Hollywood's most well-liked actors, and Mary Poppins had been a huge hit. Then, it was announced that Walt Disney had unexpectedly gone away. A few weeks after receiving a lung cancer diagnosis, he passed away. Dick experienced a personal earthquake while the rest of the world was in disbelief. When Walt wasn't at the Disney studio, the atmosphere was different. In Dick's opinion, the industry had lost its direction. He frequently recalled the counsel Walt had given him during those exhausting days on the shoot. Years later, Dick still felt his mentor's spirit whenever he worked on a Disney project or went to Disneyland. Walt has done more than merely create a business, he realized. Through his own efforts, Dick felt obligated to maintain the spirit of happiness he had created. Dick's connection with Gene Hackman, a passionate and gifted actor, will be the subject of our next discussion. Hackman Gene. Hollywood was rapidly evolving in the 1960s and 1970s. Family entertainment and lighthearted comedy were dominated by Dick Van Dyke. Gene Hackman was becoming well known at the same time for portraying harsh, gritty characters. In the hectic industry of the time, they frequently came into contact despite their apparent opposites. They would cross paths at auditions, studio functions, and award shows. Dick became aware of Gone for the first time when the film business began to abandon its traditional methods. Gone stood for a new, unpolished acting technique, whereas Dick represented the refined singing and dancing style of performance. There was an instant connection in spite of these distinctions. They were both diligent workers who had worked for years to achieve success. Dick had insight into a different aspect of the entertainment industry after meeting Gene, and he came to appreciate the passion Gone took to each part. Actors mingle at events and parties called the Hollywood Circuit, where they spent time together. They discussed acting techniques and how to remain current in a changing environment. Dick was fascinated by Gene's approach to creating a character from the ground up. The news of Gone Hackman's death arrived in January 2025. Dick was devastated by this loss. Due to the fact that they shared a similar age and had experienced the same period of Hollywood history. It seemed like a personal reminder of how much time had gone by when Gene died. There is more to the death of someone like Gene than just the loss of a person. Both a certain historical period and a whole acting style are lost. Gene was one of the few persons who truly knew what it was like to work in Hollywood during those mid-century decades, so Dick was devastated by this loss. Over the years, they had many of the same co-stars. Dick and Gene were among the few people who remained to commemorate those co-stars after their deaths. Dick felt that a large portion of his professional world had vanished with Gene's departure. He talked about how much he would miss Gene's integrity and fortitude. The loss of such a powerful peer left Dick feeling a little more empty in the movie industry. The late Edner, who portrayed the tough yet endearing boss on TV, will now be discussed. Eden. Because of their relationship with Mary Tyler Moore, Dick Van Dyke and Edner initially came into contact in a meaningful way. In the 1960s, Dick was the main character, but Edner rose to fame in the 1970s as Lou Grant, the sour yet endearing news station manager on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. The actors frequently encountered one another at the studio because these two productions were the biggest hits for the same company. Working together on special television events and guest slots helped them develop a professional bond. For them, the Mary Tyler Moore Hour in 1979 was a significant event. The new cast members would perform alongside the veteran cast members on this variety show. They discovered that their rhythm came naturally to Dick and Ed. They were able to support one another in a scene while playing rather different kinds of characters. Ed appreciated Dick's renowned stature in the television industry, and Dick was amazed by Ed's ability to be humorous while being extremely serious. Dick and Ed's friendship was frequently characterized as having an unusual pair dynamic. Edner was well known in real life for being quite stern and outspoken about his convictions. He was very active in politics and never hesitated to voice his opinions or organize a demonstration for a cause he supported. Dick Van Dyke, however, was well known for his upbeat, bright, and humorous demeanor. Although it appeared that they would not get along, they ended up becoming really close soulmates. A major factor that united them was their involvement with the Screen Actors Guild. Actors are safeguarded and entitled to fair treatment by this union. Both Dick and Ed held leadership positions and have a strong concern for their fellow actors' welfare. Hours would pass while they talked about the character actor's craft. For them, acting was more than just being a well-known celebrity. It was about the laborious process of creating a convincing character on screen. They were both very respectful of their profession's past. Dick was one of the few persons who could consistently bring a sincere smile to Edner's hard exterior, which concealed a truly compassionate heart. Edner died at the age of 91 in August of 2021. This loss was very devastating for Dick Van Dyke. There were already a lot of folks from that particular television era gone by the time Ed passed away. Ed's passing was like losing the only member of the Mary Tyler Moore family who genuinely understood what it was like to be a member. Dick described Ed as one of the last genuine actors of their time in a lovely tribute. He was referring to the fact that Ed was among those who remained committed to the profession and the performing community to the very end. Dick expressed his longing for Ed's strength and honesty. In Dick's opinion, Ed was a rock in a constantly evolving industry. Dick felt as though he was the last man standing, hence this death had a great personal cost. When you turn 100 years old, you realize that the majority of your co-workers, the folks you joked with, worked with, and advocated for improved working conditions, are no longer with you. Ed served as one of the last connections to Dick's most prosperous years. Ed was gone, therefore there was no one remaining to share memories of those particular days at the studio. Although Dick felt alone, he found solace in the knowledge that he and Ed had maintained such a close friendship throughout the years. By continuing to discuss the value of the Actors Union and the lessons they had learned together, he preserved Ed's memory. As he reflects on a century of amazing memories, Dick manages to remain active and joyful despite the loss of many of his friends. If you liked this retrospective of Dick Van Dyke's amazing life, please subscribe and use the like button for more tales of your favorite icons.